Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. I recently received the limited edition Warhammer Plus miniature, which this time is a cadian Kasrkin, and rather than leaving him in the box gathering dust on my shelf, I thought I'd get him painted up. This will be a quick overview of how I went about painting him, but it should also be really useful for painting any cadians or any other Kasrkin models. Hopefully this will be a useful guide if you're planning on painting up any other Kasrkins or waiting for this model to arrive and want a guide for painting him. It's a really lovely model, full of character and based on some of the artwork from one of the old codexes. There's no options in the box, he only goes together one way, which seems to be the standard for these Warhammer Plus miniatures. Once I had him all built and cleaned up, I put some glue on the base and gave him a quick dunk in my homemade basing material. I then put him to one side for a few hours to dry before priming him black. I then gave him a spray from above with grey cere before building up the first base coat of Xandri dust, concentrating mainly on the fatigues. I also kept the head separate and didn't bother gluing this in just yet to make it easy to paint later. I then started to paint in the armour using Castellan green. This is a very thin transparent paint, so I needed to go over this a few times. I think I maybe used about 3 coats to get a good smooth finish. Once all the green was blocked in on the armour and I was happy with how it looked, I then started to shade the armour using Creed Camo contrast paint. I went over the whole of the green armour, making sure to get all the recesses and not to miss any of the details. I then did the same thing with the fatigues, this time using Agrax Earthshade. I went back over this a second time, adding a little bit more of the shade into the deeper recesses to give it a little bit more definition. And this is how he looked after this stage was finished. Next I started blocking in the black areas using Black Legion contrast paint. I gave all of these areas 2 thin coats of this. I filled in all of the undersuit areas, the gun, the cables and also everywhere else that I'd be adding metallics to later on, as it gives a much better surface colour to work with. With the majority of the base coats on, I then went about layering up the colours to brighten them and to add a little bit more definition to the mini. I made a 50-50 mix of Castellan green and Strachan green, and then added a thin layer of this over the green armour, making sure to leave some of the darker areas of the Castellan green showing towards the recessed parts. I did the same process again using a 50-50 mix of Xandri dust and Ushabti bone on the fatigues, again keeping the original darker colour showing towards the recesses. And here he is once all this layering stage was done. Next I then highlighted all of the fatigues using Screaming Skull, just making sure to get all of the details and getting a nice crisp edge. I then did the same again on the green armour, this time using Strachan green and adding a neat highlight to all of the panels and any rivets. To finish off the green, I then added a second highlight, this time using Nurgling green. I was a little bit more selective about where I was using this though, and kept it only to the most raised areas of the armour. Here's the mini at this stage. The armour and the fatigues are now done and you could easily leave them at this step, especially if you just painted standard cadians, but I really wanted to then add the camo markings that are on the traditional Kasrkin armour. The first step was to start to block in the patterns on the armour. I used Doomball Brown and then very slowly and carefully started to mark out some triangles and some other random geometric shapes, adding 1 or 2 to each panel and trying to keep everything evenly spaced. I then used Doomball Brown again just to fill these shapes in, giving it 2 thin coats just to keep everything nice and smooth. Once I was happy with all of the shapes, I then used Pallid Witch Flesh to add an off-white border to the camo markings. I did this with a few layers to build up the colour slowly, as this paint can be a bit chalky and difficult to work with. I then tidied up the edges with some more Doomball Brown until I was happy with the lines and everything was as clean as I could get them. This is quite a long process, but worth it for the final look when the armour was complete. I then filled in all of the metal areas using lead belcher, including all of the grenades, the belt buckle and the sword. Once all of the lead belch was on and dry, I then shaded it with a thin coat of Nuln Oil. I also added 2 thin coats of Plague Bearer flesh to the smoke grenades on his chest. The other grenades also had a quick coat of Incubi Darkness added to the raised areas. I also added a yellow stripe to the smoke grenades for some extra detail. To add some definition to the black parts, I gave all of the raised areas a quick thin coat of Corvus Black, leaving the recesses darker. I painted in the pouches on his belt using Eshin Grey and gave them all a shade with Nuln Oil when they were dry. The last step for the black was to give it a highlight. For this, I first used Dark Reaper, picking out all of the edges and the details. Next, I finished off this stage for the black using Fenrisian Grey, but this time concentrating towards the most raised areas and any of the rivets on the gun. The sword hilt was then given a layer of gold using Retributor armour, and I then gave this a very quick highlight using Ironbreaker. I then used Ironbreaker to layer up the sword just to brighten it towards the end of the blade, and also used the same paint again to highlight all of the metallics across the whole of the model. Just as a final touch, I added a little bit of Athematic Blue with my airbrush just to the power node on the sword, but this step could easily be done with just a standard brush if you don't have an airbrush. And here he is, all finished. As this was just a quick overview, I made the decision to paint the face off camera. Unfortunately, I'm still getting used to painting whilst filming at the same time, and I found this quite difficult to do. I do plan on doing another video at some point relatively soon showing how I do faces, so if you are interested then please subscribe to the channel. I really hope that you found this video useful, and as always thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all soon.